All right, Cynthia, thank you for that introduction and thank you for the invitation to talk with your group today. I'm really excited to share this research. I think it's really important for our communities to be aware of the lead hazards that they may encounter. So again, my name is Alyssa Shiel. I'm a professor at OSU. My talk today is titled Reducing Lead Hazards in Urban Gardens. So I'm going to first, oops. There we go. First, I'll give a little bit of an introduction to who I am. So I'm an associate professor at OSU. I'm in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. I run a lab that is mostly student focused. So I work with undergraduate and graduate students. There's a picture of my group up there in the corner. I have a young family also pictured there. I've been in Oregon now about 10 years, and I grew up in southern areas, so in kind of drier climates. I got interested in research and started in research during my undergraduate degree at the University of Arizona, where I did community-based environmental work. So kind of broadly, my research interests are on understanding the distributions and identifying sources of metals that may threaten human and ecosystem health. So looking around to see what levels are of these metals in our urban environments, in our natural environments, as well as tracing back, determining where they are coming from. And I use that information to assess risk and reduce environmental levels and exposures. So some folks may wonder why the focus on lead. And I do study other trace metals, other heavy metals, but I keep coming back to lead because the health outcomes associated with chronic exposure to lead are extremely devastating. And these include things like lower IQ, poor academic performance, behavioral issues, speech and learning deficits, and reduced hearing. At high levels of exposure, you can see seizures, coma, and death. But even at low doses, we see detrimental effects later in life. And newer research is showing that there's harm for adults as well. We see things like high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. For lead, no safe level has been identified. And when we look at who's impacted by exposures to lead, we do see disparities among the communities impacted. For lead, when you're thinking about low doses of exposure, the things like lower IQ, poor academic performance, those may not be things that a parent will notice. It may be kind of hard to tell. And so testing rates for testing is the only real way to know if you've had an exposure that's of a low level. And so in Oregon, we have low testing rates. Just 7% of children under 6 are tested. And so this is actually kind of frightening because it means that we could be missing a lot. And children are really the most vulnerable to the impacts of lead. So what is lead? So lead is a naturally occurring element that's found in the Earth's crust. It's toxic to humans and animals, even at low levels. We see it in air, soil, water, and even in our homes. Distributions today largely reflect human activities, including the historical use of leaded gasoline, which was banned in 1996, the use of lead-based paints, and emissions from industrial facilities. Lead's been used in products such as paint, ceramics, pipes, solders, gasoline, batteries, ammunition, and even cosmetics. So how are people exposed to lead? The primary routes of exposure are inhalation or ingestion. And so this means you may be exposed by drinking contaminated water, eating fruits or vegetables grown in contaminated soil, ingesting the soil for children or even adults playing in bare soil, gardening and landscaping, or for kids touching hand to mouth. So what are the important sources of lead? I think folks typically think about lead from drinking water. In recent years, we've heard about, the contamination of water, the widespread contamination of water in Flint, Michigan. And so I think that got back on people's radar, that the importance of lead pipes in terms of the source for lead, and also lead paint. Folks may also have heard of different spices, mainly cinnamon and turmeric, that are sometimes contaminated with lead. Even lead may even be added to those spices in some cases to give them their color. And so I think these are kind of the sources people are used to thinking about, are still kind of on our radars. In the last decade, there's been some federal action to try to get lead out of our cities, including tightening up of standards around lead-based paints, and infrastructure law funding to help remove lead pipes across the country. And this is really needed and important work. So I'm very glad to see this. But I've heard less about outdoor lead sources, and really, prior to my research, getting a sense of how much of a problem they still are in our communities. Following the ban of leaded gasoline, I think a lot of folks assume that we had solved that problem, but of course, that's not the case. So based on all of that, I wanted to launch into an urban investigation of lead levels in a city, and I chose Portland. This work was done in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service, and folks that live in Portland may remember, kind of maybe in 2016, news stories about Portland moss being used to find high levels of cadmium in some neighborhoods in Portland, and that those high levels of cadmium were eventually attributed to art glass manufacturers, and that was previously an unknown source of pollution. The power of using something like moss across the city. This is a moss that grows on street trees. It's found everywhere. And so in this study, we were able to use 347 samples collected from all of the places you see a blue dot across the city. And this type of high resolution look at lead across the city really allows us to see where there's differences, where there's high levels. This kind of contrasts what's typically done in cities, which is relying on one or two air monitors. And when you have one or two air monitors, it's really only going to give you information about air quality at that one location. And so the idea is with moss is that we can get a high resolution look at lead across the entire city. The moss species we chose grows on trees. It's very common in Portland. It gets its nutrients and its moisture from the air, and it also inadvertently gets things like lead from the air. And so its tissue concentrations really reflect air quality, local air quality. And so, as you can imagine, what we expected to see was high lead levels near kind of industrial areas, and then cleaner levels throughout the rest of the city. But the story was, of course, more complicated. So now here is a map again of Portland showing all of those sampling locations where we collected moss. But now the sample dots are colored based on their concentration of lead. So the lead concentrations are shown in parts per million or micrograms per gram lead. And in terms of what you'd expect, in kind of rural areas outside the city, we see 0.5 parts per million lead in this particular moss species. And then across the city, we see levels ranging from 1 part per million all the way up to 129 parts per million. And so the cooler colors here, kind of starting with the blues, are our lowest concentrations, and then our warm colors are the highest concentrations. In general, there seems to be kind of a spatial trend where the outskirts of the city, the outer edges of the city have lower concentrations. We see more blues and greens on the edges. And then the oldest part of the city, we believe, right? The center of the city, we see more warm colors, including some oranges and reds. And so we wanted to see if there really was an impact on the age of the neighborhood. And so we wanted to kind of compare the levels we saw to the age of each neighborhood. And so here's a map showing the ages of different Portland neighborhoods. So we have kind of the cooler colors, our newer neighborhoods in Portland, and then the warm colors are the older neighborhoods in Portland. And there is this spatial trend in general, right, where the oldest parts of the city are really central, and then the younger neighborhoods are further out. And so what we did is we decided to graph those two things together. So this is a histogram where we have the number of moss samples kind of shown there on the left, on the y-axis. And then along the bottom there on the x-axis, we show the lead concentrations. So on the left, we have a sample, our lowest level sample. It's 1 part per million. And then all the way over to the right, you see the sample that's 129 parts per million lead. And we've colored each sample in this case based on the age of the neighborhood it was sampled from. And so the lower concentrations you see mostly have kind of are either kind of a gray-black color because they're from the outskirts outside of Portland proper, or they're these cooler colors, blues and greens. And then our higher concentrations are generally these warmer colors there, including even our highest concentration sample, right, is from, you know, pre-1900 in these neighborhoods developed in the late 1800s. And so there does seem to be a clear trend of higher lead in older Portland neighborhoods. But if we go back and we look at this map, that's not the only thing going on. It's really not perfect, where you just have the highest levels in the center of the city and then levels decrease. It does look to be more complicated. You'll notice in some locations, for example, in West Portland in the Kenton neighborhood, this is where the highest lead level was found. And we see a bright red circle there, but it's neighbored by samples that are green and yellow, and those are in close proximity. And so how is it that we have this really high lead level right next to these kind of more average levels for the city? And so we knew that it was more complicated, and we spent actually several years trying to figure this out, trying to understand what was going on. And then in the summer, before the paper came out, there was this reporting by the Wall Street Journal, and the headline was, "America is wrapped in miles of toxic lead cables." And when we read this article, we were like, we wonder if this is it. And when we went back to our sites and we looked up, we saw these lead cables. And I mean, this wasn't obvious to us to begin with, because a lot of the neighborhoods with these really high lead levels, these are residential neighborhoods. These are not neighborhoods full of industries. These are neighborhoods with a lot of families, a lot of people out going to parks, a lot of people gardening. And so we really didn't know what to expect, but in fact, it wasn't someplace we were looking originally, it was up. And so um, once, once we realized that, we went back through all of our sites to see how many of them had lead cables. And here I have some pictures of these lead cables. You can see on the lower cables there, the lowest cables there, those are the telecommunication cables. And the lead cables actually look metallic. They're often hung from cable rings. I'll show some more pictures of those later. The picture on the right, perhaps it's the most clear. I mean, these really are what amounts to a lead pipe that's protecting those old copper telephone lines. These were installed pre-1950s through across the US, connecting folks with the telephone. All right, so this is that same map, but in this case, I've changed the circles to stars for locations where we found lead cables. And so you see a lot of those higher concentration samples, a lot of the orange and red ones are now stars because we found lead cables at those sites. And in part of our initial study, we found 11 out of Portland's 98 neighborhoods had lead cables. But following the release of the paper, we're actually up to 40 neighborhoods in Portland where we have identified lead cables. And I'm showing these, I'm highlighting these here on the map. And I have a website that we'll link to where there is a copy of this map. And I also list the neighborhoods if folks are curious. And it's difficult to tell just directly from the map where they are. So, one thing that would be nice if there was a map available really everywhere showing the locations of these cables, and there isn't. So a lot of my effort has actually shifted to finding out where these cables are. All right, so I wanted to just pause here to highlight some of the big results of that study that we did. So one was just that older neighborhoods have higher lead than both rural areas and in younger neighborhoods. And while this is, I think, intuitive for most people, because they'd have a longer history of leaded gasoline use and there may, leaded paint would have been present. The fact that they're 19 times higher is maybe a bit surprising. Something else that I think gets lost in some cases is that we still see leaded gasoline emissions as a key lead source across the city. And this is 30 years after the US ban. So, lead cables were responsible in the study for the highest levels, but across the whole city, we see elevated levels of lead. The rural background is 0.5, and the average across the city is something like 5 parts per million. So the whole city is relatively elevated. And that's primarily attributable to historical leaded gasoline use. And then again, these lead sheath telecom cables were responsible for the highest lead levels we saw across the city. And in the worst case scenario, we saw lead levels that were almost 600 times that rural lead background. So quite elevated. So how are folks supposed to identify these? I had no idea these were present. I didn't know anything about these cables prior to starting this work. I didn't even initiate this work planning to study lead cables. But that's where the science has taken me. And so now I've become a bit of an expert at identifying them. And my team has tried to put together resources to help people identify cables near them that may be lead. And so again, if you go to that link, you'll find some images there and some descriptions to help you identify lead cables. On the left here, what you see is that the power lines are at the top of the pole, and then telecommunication cables are the lowest cables on the pole. This is going to include coaxial cable and fiber optic cable, and then in some cases, these lead sheath cables will still be present. When they're present, they can be different thicknesses. They often are, the lead cables themselves are pretty heavy, so often there's a support line that's present, and there's these cable rings that hold them up, that attach them to that support wire. And so these pictures show some kind of typical lead cables. Where do you find these? So this varies a lot. I mean, it's wherever the telephone cables are, you can find these lead sheath cables. And so in a lot of places, this is going to be along streets. In most of Portland, I'd say the most common place I saw them was, running along streets, kind of in that public right-of-way, that space between the sidewalk and the road. In that kind of little green belt. That's the most common place that these cables seem to run in Portland. But in some cases, especially where there's no public right-of-way, there will be utility easements. And so these cables will actually run over people's front yards, or in some cases, they run down alleys and can run over people's backyards, usually at the edge of their property. So the next thing I wanted to do is show a few more examples of pictures of these cables, as I think folks will be interested in trying to identify if there's any lead cables near them. So I've put in a number of pictures here to show you. This is a very thick diameter lead cable, and you can see it's strung there on a support wire with cable rings supporting it. And you can see pretty clearly in this picture that it's kind of got this matte metallic appearance. In, I'd say, most Portland neighborhoods where I found these cables, the cables are much skinnier, and so they can be harder to identify. Here, I'm showing two skinnier cables, or it looks like one skinny cable, and then I've blown it up there on the bottom. One skinny cable, but again, you see those cable rings, which is a clue that this is a lead cable. Here, again, I have a skinnier lead cable shown. It's the same cable there on the bottom. It's just blown up, so it's a little bit easier to see. The tricky part with this one is that there's no support wire and cable rings. And so this one, you really have to be able to see that it is got a metallic appearance. And then these cables can often have these where they're spliced together will actually be thicker in places, or even taped. I kind of call them little sausages. But that's another giveaway that you're looking at a lead cable. Here's another example. This one is kind of tricky to see from the ground without blowing it up. It's a pretty skinny cable there. And then I wanted to give some examples of where I've seen the cable. So this is actually in a place where it's over a pretty thin public right-of-way strip. And so, people are maybe not that likely to interact with the contaminated soil very much. But in other cases, these cables run right over people's yards, right the front of people's yards, or in this case, over a pretty thick public right-of-way where people are setting up these beautiful raised bed gardens and are going to be unaware that there's lead cables overhead that may be leaching lead into those soils. Right, so this is now, I wanted to spend a little bit of time giving you an update about where the research has gone, what I'm doing now. So we concluded and published that study on moss, and we've moved to soil. Soil is more likely to be the vehicle that people are interacting with. So, ingestion or inhalation of contaminated soil is more of a direct concern. So we wanted to have a look at how high the lead levels are in soils in Portland. And this work is really just beginning. The main thing we're looking for is how high they are relative to EPA screening levels for lead. These are 200 parts per million lead generally, or 100 parts per million lead in places where you have more than one potential lead source. So depending on, I guess, the residential area, if there's other lead sources there, like residents may be exposed to, for example, lead from their drinking water or lead paint, then the 100 parts per million level would be the screening level. And in cases where there's not known other sources of lead, then the 200 parts per million screening level would be used. And so in our preliminary investigation, we're seeing levels above the 200 parts per million screening level in soils underneath this cable. This doesn't surprise us, but we still have more work to do. The EPA has started investigations in soil. They've been focused on lead cable sites in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey. And the mean levels, the average levels they found in both of their investigations were above that 200 parts per million lead level. And the maximum levels, it's important to note, are quite high. Within Pennsylvania, in the smaller study of 31 samples, the highest level they found was 1,400 parts per million, and then New Jersey, even higher, 3,400 parts per million in their larger study of 192 samples. And so just thinking about the top soils that people are most likely to interact with in those studies, 73% of the samples that they tested were over that 200 parts per million screening level limit set by the EPA. And 91% of them were over the 100 ppm limit set by the EPA. And I'll just show you a map of one of their studies. So this is their investigation in West Orange, New Jersey. And this is a map, or I guess a aerial picture of a section of the city. And along this street, Gregory Avenue, there is a thick lead cable. And so they sampled along the street, under the cable, and then and then across the street less frequently. So they ended up with samples on both sides of the street, sampling most frequently directly under the lead cable. And they were looking at the surface soil, the topsoil in this case, so sampling kind of that top 2 inches of soil. And what they found was elevated lead under much of the lead cable. So the green samples, you see some of these, especially on the opposite side of the street, are less than that 200 parts per million screening level. The yellow samples are 200 to 400 parts per million. 400 parts per million is the old EPA screening level. And then over 400 parts per million are those red samples. And when I went back and looked at this site, I visited it late last year. One of the things that I noticed, one of the things I think is causing this pattern where some of the samples were above the limit and then a few of them are green, right? They're below that 200 parts per million level, is I think a lot of that has to do with what's being done in the soil. So these are residential, this is a residential street. And so in some cases, folks may be landscaping and removing that topsoil, and so replacing that contaminated soil kind of inadvertently, just as a part of their normal activities. Or in another place, maybe someone puts in a driveway, and so where levels were high, that soil again has been removed and replaced with cleaner soil. And so I think that's why you see this mix of mostly high, but then occasionally lower lead levels on this street. And so anyways, we're doing an investigation to try to see where we're at in Portland with respect to lead levels in the city. So in general, with lead, we expect to see higher lead levels in city centers, in older neighborhoods. We also expect to see higher lead close to busy roadways. And so that's going to be a function of both current traffic, so pollution from non-unleaded fuel and diesel fuels along our roadway, but also historical leaded gasoline emissions. We also expect to see higher lead near current or former industries that emit lead. Near homes, the drip line, so close to the house, you expect to see higher lead levels where there may have been chipping lead paint. Now we also need to think about if there's lead sheathed telephone cables present, there may be higher lead levels close to those cables as well. So is my soil contaminated with lead? Things to think about, if you're trying to determine whether or not there may be high lead levels near you or on your property. Are you living in an old home? Homes built before 1978 could have lead paint. Is there evidence of lead sheath telephone cables? And then, there could be other sources as well. So are there any facilities that emit lead nearby? And this can be current facilities or historical facilities. So, being aware of whether or not a Superfund site or another cleanup site is near you. And then a couple of other lead sources that are in the Portland area include airports, primarily smaller airports, where small aircrafts still use leaded gasoline, and the Portland Raceway, where leaded gasoline is still used in some races by older vehicles. So if folks are concerned about lead in their soils, you can get your sample tested for lead levels. You can use an accredited lab. I have a link to accredited labs on that website. There also are sometimes events to have your soil tested where you can take your soil to a site, and a handheld instrument can be used to give you an estimate of the lead level, or even have someone come out to your property and have a look. I would say that, if folks are concerned about lead levels on their property, and especially if you find that there are lead cables nearby, if you're interested, in talking to me about it, it may be that we can, your soil can be included in our study, and that would be another way to find out what the lead levels are like, and how far the lead is getting from the lead cables. So in terms of recommendations, with the goal of reducing contamination exposure to lead, in contaminated areas, kind of broadly, the goal would be to limit access You know, in extreme cases, you know, where the lead levels are high, you know, you may want to remove contaminated soil. Depending on the levels, that might mean hiring a professional to remove them. Ground cover, grass, and mulch can be used to reduce exposure, right? If you cover the ground, if there's grass there, you're not like, it's not, contaminated soil isn't likely to be kicked up, and so you're not likely to inhale it, and you know, folks walking on it or kids playing on it aren't nearly as likely to be interacting with that contaminated soil. You can grow ornamental plants instead of food crops. It's a good idea if you are if you have high lead levels, to take off your shoes before going in the house so you don't carry contaminated soil into your home. Produce produced in soils that may have elevated lead should be washed well. Root crops can be peeled, and for leafy greens, right, which are hard to wash, those outer leaves can be disposed of. You know, and when possible, growing produce in raised beds where you know they've been filled with clean soil is a good option. This graphic is specifically thinking of lead cables. Those kind of, the recommendations I just gave still apply, but are kind of thinking more broadly, specifically for lead cables. Currently, we're recommending people kind of avoid spending time within 3 feet in either direction of the cable. And if there's bare soil, which creates the greatest risk of exposure for folks, consider putting some type of ground cover there, if there's not ground cover already. So sidewalks are going to reduce the possibility for exposure. Grass and other vegetation are also going to reduce the risk. Landscaping kind of aside, where it if there are lead cables, it may make sense to use some caution. Okay, so this slide has a lot of names. I just want to acknowledge my research team, Sarah Jovan at the U.S. Forest Service, and Christina Murphy at OSU. I worked with a great communications team here who helped me put together the website. And again, I work with a lot of students, and so they're named there on the right. And then I have some funding sources there on the bottom, which have facilitated this research and kind of ongoing research. So again, I think there's in the chat, you can see a link to the website, but here's a QR code if you would like to find that website to learn more about lead cables. Please head over there. And if folks have questions about whether or not cables near them are lead, if you've looked at the website and you're not sure, or you think you found some, I would love to hear from you. So, you know, I'm happy to take questions now, but also feel free to contact me later with questions or comments you may have on lead cables or something else. So now I think I'll stop there and see if there's any questions from folks.
Thank you, Alyssa. This was incredibly enlightening. So much to learn, and especially interesting that it's moss, because we did have a presentation back when there were all the issues with chromium and the like. And again, as you pointed out, it was moss that led to the questions and answers that we got. We think of moss and lichens as just these tiny little things, but they do hold a lot of information for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So we did have a couple questions. Anybody who has further questions are welcome to type them into the Q&A chat box, I should say. And the first question was when you were talking about the ages of neighborhoods. And the question is, why is there a gap of 30 years in the age of neighborhoods? My neighborhood was mostly built in 1920s, but no data for that decade.
Yeah, good question. So I used neighborhood annexation dates. So rather than the like some sort of average of the age of housing in the neighborhoods, and I guess in the development of Portland, maybe there weren't as many neighborhoods annexed during that period, that gap period. That data is from the city. I guess the answer is I'm not sure why there's a gap there, but I mean, I don't think it actually had to do with a total stoppage of kind of growth in the city, but it's probably reflects that I used neighborhood annexation decade as opposed to like housing age.
Hmm. I wasn't aware that that was that gap. Interesting to learn.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know exactly why that was myself.
And another question was, do you have a way to control for how long the moss has been in a given site? I am assuming longer time leads to higher exposure.
Yeah, good question. So when we're collecting these moss, they are of different ages, but we do trim them before measuring the meta levels. So we trim off the older part of the moss, and we're aiming to have growth that occurred in the last few years, that represents the last few years. And that's not necessarily perfect. It may be that there's our older samples do represent kind of lead over a longer period. But generally speaking, I think that gets us to a picture of what's going on in recent years. In a few sites where we think it's really important to know when the moss, how long the moss has been growing, like there are some neighborhoods where I found really high levels of lead, and then I went back to them and I didn't find lead cables, and I was really scratching my head because we use chemical isotope fingerprinting and it really pointed to lead cables, but there weren't lead cables. So I went back in time on Google Street View. You can look at different dates and at a lot of locations going back maybe 10 or so years. And I found that the lead cables had been removed about 10 years prior at the site we were looking at. And so for sites like that, one of the things we did is we could identify, if we wanted to know if lead was still contaminated in the neighborhood, if it was still an issue, if we could, in the Google Street View pictures, identify trees that were put in after the cables were removed, we could sample from those trees. And so there's some tricks that way, I guess, as well.
It's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is a bit of a screening tool, there's definitely more to be done here.
And here's a question. What utility is responsible for potentially removing lead telecommunication cables? Would property owners still be responsible for soil cleanup?
Mm. Yeah, those are tricky questions. I mean, the Public Utilities Commission is aware of this work, and they've been investigating, trying to get a better handle on how many of these cables are in this state. Folks can contact them that are concerned. If you are still have a landline, if there's lead cables in your neighborhood, if you still have a landline, or if there's an easement on your property and one of these cables goes off over your property, you can absolutely contact the responsible utilities, and ask some questions, even ask to have them removed. That doesn't mean they will be removed, but you can certainly request that. I've had some residents contact me and say they've done just that. Nationally, these cables are owned mostly by Verizon and AT&T, but in our state, ownership is different. It's gone to some smaller companies, and they kind of gobble each other up over time. And so sometimes it can be hard to keep track of it. I think a lot of people in Portland maybe have CenturyLink. And I think, you know, gosh, there's I think two other companies maybe in the States that I think CenturyLink has actually turned into something else that may be responsible for them in the state. Uh, but yeah, it's tricky. I'm not actually sure these companies that have inherited these lead cables have the workforce to take them down. I mean, I think, in terms of where I hope to see progress on it, it's actually the Public Utilities Commission working with them, where I'm, hoping to see progress. Certainly the city or the county, could investigate what they could do as well to put pressure on these companies to take these cables down. In terms of the soil cleanup, it's not clear if there are situations yet where the Department of Environmental Quality will step in and be responsible for cleanup. I think that still remains to be seen. Certainly residents that are concerned can remove any contaminated soil, or try to put in some sort of mitigation strategy like mulch cover or grass cover to minimize risk for exposure. I mean, if folks are buying these lead cables and are concerned and would like some specific contact information, I'm available by email. I'm to try to provide um, those resources.
Thank you. And then do you have any recommendations for plants that can be grown in a garden to absorb lead from the soil, which can then be removed to help clean the soil?
Yeah, I don't know that, kind of this phytoremediation that is for lead has gotten to a point where I can really recommend it. It's something I could look into a bit more. Um, but I don't know it's something that folks can really rely on to clean up their soils. I think, for lead contaminated sites, like industrial contaminated sites, the cleanup is really the removal of the soil or capping it, so basically making it inaccessible, so you don't see exposures. So I don't know that I think remediation is something folks can do, although it's an active research area. Um, you know, Thinking about what crops, what plants you're growing there is certainly important to minimize exposures. I mean, there have been a few cases where I do see gardens either directly under these cables or very close to these cables, and I'm very concerned in those cases. We do make some recommendations on the website related to that, and if folks have very specific concerns they want to talk about, I'm happy to talk with folks. I mean, this is again an active research area, and so if people have specific questions, it may be that I'm looking to partner with folks to find the answers.
Wonderful. Have you explored health outcomes in residents of properties where samples were taken?
I mean, the short answer is no. We could talk to residents, although, in these older neighborhoods, it would be difficult if someone did have high lead levels. It would be difficult to determine whether or not it was from these cables or from something else like, lead paint that was on the property. And I mean, looking at correlations between the locations of these cables and certain health outcomes is something that's kind of on our radar to do. But again, it's complicated because if they're in older neighborhoods, you also have these other factors that are going to be in the same place. And also testing rates of lead in Oregon are really low. So I've been talking to Oregon Health Authority about, using existing blood lead level data and comparing that to where these cable locations are. But with the testing rates the way they are, there's not a ton of data to work with. So it's a real challenge.
I find that really interesting because, as I told you before the program started, my son, who's now 27, was tested when he was 1 year old, and it was at the suggestion of our family practitioner. Apparently, that's not on those lists anymore of recommendations.
For lead testing for children under the age of 2 is recommended in all cases where there's a possible lead exposure. So any or a risk factor. So kids from living in older neighborhoods certainly should be recommended to get a lead test. I think kids on Medicaid are required to get tested for lead, although that's not enforced. So the testing rates among kids on Medicaid is still actually very, very low, even though it's required. I mean, I think there's some work to be done communicating with pediatricians to make sure it is still something that's recommended, and that risk factors like the presence of these lead cables gets on their radar, because in some of these old neighborhoods, you've had houses that are replaced, right? So you could be living in a new house in an old neighborhood, and you don't have any lead paint in your house is new, but these lead cables could still be present outside. So so that's another place that it's been missed. And I mean, I have young kids. Our pediatrician did ask us about measuring lead in our youngest blood when he was under 2. But lots of my friends who also have young kids said their pediatrician didn't even talk to them about it. And so I think it is mixed.
Fascinating. There's just so much to explore in this topic. We really appreciate you taking the time and coming in so quickly when I asked you to prepare this for us. Generally, we're booking months or even a year ahead, and it's just been wonderful that you were able to come forward so quickly for us. Oh, I think Shuju has a question. Sorry, Shuju.
Yeah, sorry, I cannot submit questions on the Q&A panel. So I actually have 3 questions.
Wonderful.
If you're mulching over the contaminated soil, wouldn't the overhead cable continue to add lead to the mulch?
Yeah, that's a great question, a great point. In general, I mean, this would apply to whether or not you're replacing the soil with clean soil or you're putting something over it. If you haven't removed that lead cable, the lead contamination will continue. So, I mean, ideally, I'd like to see that these cables removed, right? I mean, like before you start cleaning up, normally, you like if you were going to clean your, try to dry your bathtub, you wouldn't start drying it with towels and then wait to turn off the water. Wait, you turn off the water first and start toweling it dry.
Analogy.
Yeah. So it seems a little bit backwards. And I am advocating for taking these cables down. I mean, based on what I see with leaded gasoline, I don't want more lead in our cities. It doesn't go away. So like the more we put in, we are stuck with it. And so I cannot see how that is a good thing when there's no safe level of lead. But I would say, in terms of a practical point, these cables have been up a long time. And so the amount of lead they've put into the soil below them, could be really high. And, while they'll continue to leak lead below them, if that contaminated soil is removed and clean soil is put in, I expect the level, that they're not going to increase super quickly. They're not going, it's almost 100 years they may have been up collecting lead. And so I think there may still be good in covering them up or replacing that soil.
Okay, second question. Are there consumer products that you are aware of that's actually good for testing lead?
Yeah, good question. I mean, for lead paint, they they sell these sticks. You can typically get them at somewhere like Home Depot or online, where there are these little sticks that change color. You break them, release the chemical, and then you put a little spot of the chemical on your wall, and then it changes a color, different colors depending on if there's lead present or lead not present. That's a good test for people looking to know if there's lead paint in their home. But I am not aware of anything like that for soils. Or really kind of any kind of or that could be used on plants, anything. I mean, I think really having some sort of analysis where you're sending a sample to a lab and they're dissolving it and measuring those levels, or using an handheld instrument, which would be the cheaper option and an option that's available to look at more samples. That could be done on your property, or like I said, sometimes there's events. I mean, maybe if there's demand for it, maybe the county could have an event where people can bring their soil. I mean, I know these events have been done before, I believe in Multnomah County, and they've been done in Eugene, where people bring out their soil and someone there has a handheld instrument and tests it. And so, if there's enough demand, maybe that's something that is possible.
Okay, one last question before we move on to more questions in the Q&A tab. So do you know Tamara Rubin? She's an activist that works with reducing lead. She has a child who's now an adult who was severely impacted by lead. And I think her website is Let's Save Mama.
Oh. So I do not know Tamara Rubin, but I have been on that website
Okay.
many times. So I mean, maybe that's someone I should reach out to if folks here know Tamara and want to do an introduction for me. That's great. But I mean, I could reach out to her as well. Yeah, she's doing great stuff trying to get the word out,
Okay, so yeah, so back to the Q&A.
Thank you, Shuju. There was a comment that you can get a soil test for heavy metals, and that Simply Soils was recommended. Are you familiar with that at all, Alyssa?
No, I'm not familiar with that. If someone sends that to me, I can look it up and maybe it could be added to the website as a resource. Uh, the ones I link to are accredited labs, EPA accredited labs. And I actually don't think there's any in the state. I don't know if Simply Soils is maybe in the state. That could be a good option, but I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. And someone said they're aware of soil lead tests available online, for instance, on Amazon, and said, is there something we should look for to indicate a good test? And I think you kind of answered that it should be going to an EPA recommended, or not recommended, EPA lab, EPA certified lab.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna look at those online soil tests
Okay.
and see. I mean, in general, I'm not going to be able to recommend those. If I'll have a look at them and if I don't know, maybe if I mean, I measure lead in samples, moss and soil regularly, and so maybe if those look interesting, maybe I'll buy some and try to compare it to see if I can make a recommendation, or if those would give people a ballpark or not. I don't see any, the DEQ or EPA or anybody recommending those, and so I really can't recommend those. I mean, if folks are really concerned about levels and, especially if they have lead cables, you're welcome to contact me and see if there's space in the study where we could include the samples or samples from your yard and share the results with you. But yeah, these accredited labs are more likely to be a better option if that's a resource available to you.
And the person who posted about Simply Soil, Lorna, gave a website. It's simplysoiltesting.com, and they're apparently located in Skagit County, Washington.
Okay, I'll check them out. Thank you.
And that seems to be the end of the questions. Again, really appreciate your time and being willing to come visit with us at such short notice. For everybody who's attending, this is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel within a couple days. And you're welcome, of course, to spread those links to other people interested in the topic or other master gardeners, so that we can get the word out about this new to us issue. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.